The Ash'ari position is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't actually speak by his will and his power. He doesn't speak or is not attributed with the attribute of kalam as a verb. He's not a God who actually speaks, which makes him honestly akin to the idols of the pagan idolaters that they worshipped, a God who doesn't actually speak and is not capable of actually speaking.
So as you have just heard from Jake, the metaphysician of Tadsim, he said that the Sunni Ash'ari A'imma, the position they hold regarding the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is akin to the idols that the Mushrikeen used to worship. You might say, wow, this is a big claim. But these people are known for it. As is reported that Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam in the Bible, he said, you shall know them by their fruits. So the fact that Jake adheres to the Wahhabi Taymian creed, it's no surprise for him to come out with outrageous and slanderous statements like this against the A'immah of Islam. What I hope to do in this recording, inshallah ta'ala, is based on the accusation that Jake has made. He said that our position is akin, our belief is akin to the idols of the Mushrikeen. We're going to see if this claim is true or not. We're going to compare our beliefs, the beliefs of the Sunni Ash'aris in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we're going to compare that with the beliefs that Jake holds to and see who's more in line with the Mushrikeen, with the idols. طيب, Bismillah. Let's begin. Number one, idols have a place. Jake's God has a place. We, the Sunni Ash'aris, we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists without place. Who's more in line with the idols, with the idol worship? Now you might say that place is conceptual. Yeah, okay, conceptual. But place is a limitation that is connected to creation. It does not apply to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it still doesn't get you out of the problem that you're in. Number two, idols have a limit to their being. They have a spatial limit. Jake's God has a limit, has a spatial limit. We, the Sunni Ash'aris, believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's being is not limited. It is without had, as the Salaf stated in their works. Most famously, Imam al-Tahawi, بلا حد ولا غاية ولا أركان ولا أعضاء ولا تحويه الجهات الست. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is without limit, without end, without tools, without limbs, and He is not in any way encompassed by the six directions. Who's more in line with the idol worshippers? Is it the Sunni Ash'aris? No, because we negate limitation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You, on the other hand, O Jake and your likes, you affirm a limit to God. You just say that only God knows His limit. We don't know how big He is. Number three, idols have a modality, a kayfiyah, a shape, a form, a hay'ah. Jake's God also has a kayfiyah, a modality. He just doesn't currently know it. We, on the other hand, we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is bila kayf, wal kayfu anhu marfu', as Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala famously stated, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala kayfiyah does not apply to Him. And this statement can be found from many A'immah of the Salaf. So, an idol has a kayf, a modality. Jake's God has a modality, he just doesn't know it yet. We, on the other hand, believe that modality does not apply to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number four, idols are in time. They change over time. Jake's God is in time and changes over time. He goes from one state to another. We, the Sunni Ash'aris, believe that time is a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a measurement of movements. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from movement. He's free from harakah. He's free from change. So time does not apply to Him. He transcends the limitation of time. So who's more in line with the idols? Number five, idols have real haqiqi, hands, legs, face, eyes, a chest and forearms, as is stated in certain books in their literature, that God created the angels from the nur, from the light of His chest and forearms. Idols have fingers, shins, feet. So does Jake's God. Jake's God, he believes that God literally has haqiqi hands, legs, face, eyes, fingers, shins, feet, possibly have ears, chest, forearms, to the end of it. So who's more in line, according to their beliefs, with the idol worship? We, on the other hand, we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not have limbs and parts and portions. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from this. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. As Imam al-Tahawi famously stated in his work, that he negated adawat wa a'da. He negated tools and limbs from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now they might say, we don't affirm limbs. We don't say God has limbs, but we affirm a literal hand for God. What is a literal hand? Go open up a dictionary. A literal hand means a limb. Okay? And the way that you would catch him out on this point, you say to him, can I point to God's hand? They're going to say, yeah, because that's Ibn Taymiyyah's statements are clear on it. Even Ibn Uthaymin, he says, God has a hissi hand, a physical hand. What that means is, one of the things that you can do with this is that you can point to God's hand. Okay, when I'm pointing to God's hand, am I pointing to God's hand and also his face? Or is it just his hand? You're going to say, no, you're pointing to God's hand. Okay, so when I'm pointing to God's hand, that's not his face. So thank you very much. You've made a distinction between God's hand and God's face. And the distinction can be witnessed and pointed to. So whether you like it or not, God, the lazim of it, God has limbs. Number 6, idols don't exist by themselves. There's always something with them. Jake's God is the same. Jake's God, there was always something there with him. He holds this position, this Taymian bid'ah position of perpetual creation, that there was always something with God. Maybe it could be just to keep God busy, so he doesn't get bored. Because Jake also affirms boredom for God, al-malal, but it's a unique malal. We, on the other hand, we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was and there was nothing with him. كان الله ولم يكن شيء معه ولا غيره. As stated in the authentic hadith of Imam Bukhari, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was and there was nothing with him. There was nothing besides him. We also believe that there is a first creation, which is the pen. For them, for the Taymis, there is no such thing as the first creation. Because there was always something with God from eternity. And then these are the same people that tell you, we follow the texts, we follow the Quran and the Sunnah and the Salaf. Tayyib, where in the Quran is perpetual creation mentioned? Where in the Sunnah is it mentioned? If anything, the Quran and the Sunnah oppose this view. Who from among the Salaf spoke about perpetual creation? Please bring me their statements. You will not find one Imam of the Salaf that spoke about this outrageous and deviant belief in perpetual creation. And these guys still have the audacity to call themselves, we are Ahlul Sunnah, we are Ahlul Athar, we follow the Quran and the Sunnah upon the way of the Salaf. It's a lie, it's a fabrication, it's a fallacy. The true representatives of the Aqeedah of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah always have been and always will be the A'imma of the Ash'ari, rahimahumullah ta'ala. Number 7, which is a really important one, so you got to focus a bit. So idols are contingent beings. Jake believes that God's speech, which is an attribute of his, is contingent. What's it contingent upon? It's contingent upon his will and his power. So the speech of God is contingent. It depends on the will and the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only relates to possibilities. What we mean by possibilities here are things that in of themselves can or cannot be. They're not necessary and they're not impossible. So let's give some examples. So something which is necessary is something that must be. Something that must be. Like the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The existence of Allah is not contingent upon anything. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists in of himself subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we say something is impossible, what we mean by impossible here is logically impossible. An example is like having a square circle. That's logically impossible. Okay? Mustahil. Or like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala having a partner, a sharik. That's logically impossible. Something which is mumkin, possible, it can or cannot be. Like what? Like us, like me and you. Our existence is not necessary. It's not impossible because we currently exist. It's possible. It's contingent. What's it dependent upon? It's dependent upon the will of Allah and the qudra, the ability of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, where's the danger in Jake's position? And when I say Jake's position here, yani the Taymian Wahhabi position. The danger is, what they're saying is that the speech of Allah is contingent. It's mumkin. It's not necessary. Now, if you look at some of the statements of the Salaf on this, you can look up Imam al-Tabari. When he spoke about the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he said that the speech of Allah is necessary. It's a sifat that wajiba lillah, mudraka bil aql. And that anyone that says otherwise is a kafir. So the clear lazim of this Taymiyan view is that the speech of Allah is contingent. It's not necessary. Wal-iyadhu billah. We, on the other hand, the Sunni Ash'aris, we say that the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is wajib. It's necessary. It's not contingent. It's not relying upon His will and His power. No. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was always attributed with this speech pre-eternally and forever and ever. And the speech of Allah is unlike our created speech. Our speech is contingent. It takes place in time. The speech of Allah is not contingent. It doesn't take place in time. It's always there. But it's only by the will and the power of Allah that Allah allows you to hear that eternal speech. That's what's contingent. You having the ability to hear that speech, that's contingent upon the will and the power of Allah, not the actual attribute itself. Wal-iyadhu billah. So again, who's more in line with the Quran, with the Sunnah, with the Salaf? Is it the Sunni Ash'aris or is it these Taymis? Who's more akin to the idol worshipping of the Mushrikeen? Another problem that arises from holding this position, and I've brought this up online in reaction to one of Jake's tweets. What is the difference between us as humans, as creations, and the speech of God? So us as humans, our creation is contingent upon the will of Allah and the power of Allah. And Allah always had knowledge of us pre-eternally. طيب, compare what I just said to their version of the speech of God. So God always had knowledge of His speech, but then with His will and with His power, His speech actualized in real time at a particular time. So in a way, we also can be ascribed to God. We're a sifa of God. The speech of Allah is an attribute of God according to them. What's the difference between the two? They might say, no, you don't understand. The speech of God is taking place, these temporal matters are taking place within the being of God. We, on the other hand, we took place outside of the being of God. So we can't be ascribed to God as a sifa, but the speech of God, because it's taking place within the being of God at a particular time, it can be ascribed back to Him. Okay, but you guys also believe that God speaks with huruf and aswat, letters and sounds. Where are these letters and sounds heard? Are they heard in creation only? Are they heard in creation or in the being of God? They're going to say no. God hears His speech, but it's also heard in the creation. So there's something which is heard in the creation that's a part of God, because letters can be broken up into parts. Different times, they're taking place in different times. So it just like it's contradiction upon contradiction. Tajseem and tashbih after tajseem and tashbih. Wal-iyadhu billah. And then the final point, the eighth point is, Jake said that we, the Ash'aris, don't believe that God can speak as a verb. What he means by a verb is at a particular time. It has to take place in a particular time. For him, for God to exist, there has to be a time and a place. Okay? And he said that this is akin to the idols that the Mushrikeen used to worship, which couldn't speak. Well, Mr. Jake, now you have, in the 21st century that we live in, we can very easily get an idol for you. Get an idol, a Buddha idol, and put some sort of speaker in there, connected to a chip of some sort. And guess what? This idol has now the ability to speak all of the languages of the world that you want, and can even interact with what you want. You can ask, it can reply to you in real time. So again, which proves that your position that you hold regarding God is more akin to the idols that the Mushrikeen used to worship than us. And this is the same guy that has the audacity to call out our ulama of our time. From among them is the respected Shaykh Sa'id Fuda, Hafidhahullah Ta'ala. This ignoramus Jake refers to Shaykh Sa'id Fuda as a hypocrite, waliyadu billah. And he refers to our positions as positions that don't make sense. And they are not upon the way of the Salaf to the end of it. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us and him and these deviant people back to the true way of our ulama, our Sunni ulama, from the Ash'ari, from the Maturidiyya, and from the Mufawwida, from the Hanabila. Wallahu a'lam, wassalamu alaykum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.